And good evening. All right, so we are in class 3 in our Megilat Esther Purim series. So, welcome to the third installment of the deeper meaning, the inside story of the Purim story. So, for those of you who are here on Zoom, who are up to date on where we are, either because you've been in our last classes or if you listen to the recordings, then you know where we are in the Purim story. And if you are new to where we're up to, don't worry, we'll catch you up on the most important details. But just so you know, there's a lot of incredible things to listen to in the previous classes. So we are at the point in the story now where we have our main characters. We have Ahasuerus, the king of Persia, who is ruling over 127 countries in his empire. He is known to be a king who is very, very smart um, when it comes to military and war and conquering nations. He is very, very powerful because he has a very, very strong hand and he kills anybody who stands in his way. And he has a very, very greedy character. And anything related to money and power and fame and anything of that nature is his most important thing. And he also does not like the Jews. Now, pause for 1 second. I'm just going to go get the door and say, so we have Achashverosh, our king. We're just going through the characters quickly. We have Mordechai the Jew, who's the leader of the Jewish people, who has been cautioning the Jewish people to return to their roots and to do the right thing and maintain their moral standard. We have Queen Esther, who is the beautiful, righteous, holy queen, the Jewish queen who nobody knew she was Jewish, but she was the queen who won the beauty pageant, not because of her physical beauty, but really because God put her in the palace for this specific purpose. Yeah, thank you. And there we go. And the character that we have been focusing on for quite a bit in our last class and where we're leading into now is the evil, wicked villain, Haman. So here we are. It's after the queen invited Ahasuerus and Haman to a party, and seeds of doubt are planted in the mind of Ahasuerus as to why is the queen inviting Haman. And the party was wonderful. Haman felt like he was on top of the world. He had his plan in motion. The decree was already sent out that the Jews are going to be destroyed. He has everyone bowing to him. He just came home from the party that he was privately, he and the king and queen were dining together. And all he can think about is his blood boiling over the fact that Mordechai the Jew does not bow to him. And he comes home and he has his big family meeting with his evil wife, Zeresh, and his 10 sons and the entire family. And of course, his daughter, the daughter that he had originally wanted to have placed in there as queen, but who Ahasuerus really did not like. And they're all coming up with plans to destroy Mordechai, and they came up with a plan, Zeresh specifically, to hang Mordechai on the gallows. And Haman is building this gallows, and he comes to the palace to get permission from the king to hang Mordechai the Jew. Now, let me tell you something. When there's construction happening, it's loud. Everybody knows about it. I mean, if someone's doing construction, you better be sending a nice bottle of wine to all your neighbors because they're not sleeping very well. Let's be real, right? That's just the way it goes when you're doing construction. And you can imagine that gallows and this huge, huge tree that was being put up to hang Mordechai was the talk of the town. So it was very, very public knowledge that Haman wanted to hang Mordechai, the Jewish leader. And Achashverosh is in his palace. It's nighttime and he cannot sleep. He's having this recurring nightmare, and he can't fall asleep, and he doesn't know what's going on. And the books of Chronicles was just read to him. And this is the part where we got to last week, where the royal reader, who was actually one of Haman's sons, was reading from this book, and he keeps trying to flip the page because he did not want to read that story, because he didn't want to read about Mordecai. But the page kept flipping back, and the king says, "No, read the book already." And he reads, Mordecai the Jew saved the king because he foiled the plan of Bigsan and Seresh. When Bigsan and Seresh, back when we talked about it in the first class, when they had wanted to poison the king, and they tried, and Mordecai thwarted that plan and saved the king's life. And Achashverosh says, so continue reading. What was the reward? And he says, there was no reward. There is no record of any reward, any payment given to Mordecai for his wonderful act. And so Achashverosh says, all right, well then, let's think of a good reward. And in comes Haman. And Haman came in just at that moment, ready to ask for permission to hang Mordecai. And the king says, Haman, I need your advice. If I want to reward someone for being so faithful, and for being such an important person in my palace, and for being such a vital member of my court, what would I give this person? Now, Haman thinks to himself, the king wants the reward. It's me. So what should I tell him? Well, whatever I would want. So Haman starts describing. He says, I believe that this person should be able to wear the king's royal robes and wear the king's crown and ride on the king's royal horse. Basically, he should be king for a day. And not only that, but he should be ridden through the town. He should be paraded through the streets. And there should be a very loud voice, somebody who's leading the horse with a entourage of, trumpets and riders and chariots, everybody announcing the arrival of this great person. And the person leading the horse should be announcing, this is what we do to the person that the king wishes to honor, and ride through the streets like that. Now, Achashverosh's first thought was, Haman thinks this is him. He realized, and it worried him, because if we remember, Achashverosh had already been doubting Haman's loyalty when Esther invited Haman to the party. And he started to suspect that maybe something was going on between Esther and Haman. And now Haman is giving this description that sounds like he wants to take over as king. And now Achashverosh is getting angry at Haman because he's thinking, well, maybe Haman is really planning to, take me out of my position and start some sort of revolution or make a coup or something and become king. And he says, this is a wonderful idea. Please go do this to Mordecai. Mordecai? Which Mordecai? Mordecai the Jew. Oh, no, there's a lot of Mordecai the Jews. Which one? He's hoping that maybe it's not going to be the one he has to do with. Mordecai the Jew, who's sitting right outside the palace gates right now, mourning in sackcloth and ashes because he's praying for the redemption of the Jews. And you be the one to do it personally. Go dress him. Go take care of him. Go put him on the horse. Go ride him through the streets. And Haman is livid. I mean, this couldn't turn out any worse. And now his grand schemes he has to do to Mordecai, his enemy. And he comes to the gates of the city and he says, Mordecai, let me tell you what you got to do. And of course, he is so upset. And he describes what is going to happen to Mordecai. And Mordecai recognizes that this is the first step in God's salvation. And Mordecai says, I'm really sorry, but I am not fit to wear the royal garments. I have been fasting for days. I haven't bathed. I haven't shaved my hair or cut my hair or anything because I'm in mourning. Not befitting of this position. So Haman took him to the bathhouse and took care of him and helped him bathe. And Mordecai's looking at him and laughing. And he says, well, Haman, this is the perfect job for you because you used to be a bathhouse attendant before you became prime minister. And then Haman gave him a haircut, which was also perfect befitting him because Haman used to be a barber. And he gets him dressed in the royal garments. And the next day, Mordecai is mounted onto the horse. Now, Mordecai was very weak. He hadn't been eating for so many days. So the horse was too high for him. So Haman actually had to bend down so Mordecai could step onto his back to get onto the horse. And this was a very, very obvious public display of the tables turning, of the tide shifting in such a drastic way that Haman, having just planned to hang Mordecai on the gallows, is now parading Mordecai through the streets, announcing, this is what is done to someone whom the king wishes to honor. Can you imagine? And everyone in the city of Shushan comes out to see what is this big ruckus. Like there was no parade planned for the day. What is going on? And Haman is very embarrassed and he has his head down. Nobody should notice that it's him. And Mordecai is being paraded through the streets. And the Jews are coming out into the streets and they see their beloved Jewish leader parading through the streets. And it is such a clear sign of their salvation, that God is on their side, that God has accepted their prayers, that they are no longer the ones who are sentenced to die. Now, technically, nothing has changed. The decree still stands. Everyone still hates the Jews. But for the Jews, it was a clear sign that things were changing, that God was sending them a message that things were going to turn out okay. Now, people who were standing at their windows had no idea who was on the horse. You couldn't exactly see from high up who was on the horse. And Zeresh, Haman's wife, and his daughter are standing at the window, and they were sure that Haman was the one riding the horse. And they thought, this is perfect. Mordecai must be leading the horse because the king loves Haman. Haman is the prime minister of Persia. Mordecai is the one leading the horse. They just took it for granted. So Haman's daughter took a bucket of waste, the chamber pot in the house, and right when this whole procession was passing under their window, she dumped it on the head of the person who is leading this procession. She thought it was Mordecai. But as soon as she heard his voice, she realized that she had just dumped garbage on her father's head. And she was so afraid of her father's anger, and she was so ashamed of what she did that she actually jumped and she killed herself. And this was very tragic. And this was definitely part of what was very clearly Haman and his family's downfall. And Haman comes home after this humiliating experience. And if you could just picture how he feels, he is embarrassed. He is disgusting. He smells. He is distraught over the death of his daughter. And all he really wants is a shower. And at that moment, as he came into the house, the guards come banging on the door. Haman, You're late for the party. Now is the party that Esther invited you to. And he said, I can't show up to the royal feast like this. And the king said, you got to come now. And he shows up to this royal feast where one day ago at a royal feast, he was on top of the world. And the next day, he was the lowest of lows. And as he's leaving, he turns to his wife and he says, what's the solution? How am I going to get rid of Mordechai and the Jews now? And his wife looks at him and says, you got it all wrong. When the Jews are on the bottom, they're all the way on the bottom. But once the Jews start rising, they rise all the way to the top. Because we have God on our side. And even Haman's wife recognized that. And she said, you're doomed. Because if the God of the Jews is on their side, you're doomed. And that was the way Haman showed up to the party. And as soon as Esther saw the state that Haman was in, and she saw how Mordechai had just been honored in this incredible way, she knew that this was her moment. So the feast begins, and Achashverosh turns to Esther, and he is very curious. And he's trying to figure out, what does his wife want from him? What does she need that she's hosting this party for the second time? And she's so secretive, and she's acting in a way that is so out of the norm for her personality and for her general mannerisms. And he says, what do you want? I will give you up to half my kingdom. And our sages tell us that what he meant by that was, I'll do anything for you other than what happens in the half of my kingdom. The midway point between Achashverosh's entire empire was the city of Jerusalem. And what he was saying was, I'll do anything up to half my kingdom. Other than rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, I'll do anything for you. Which is a sign that he started suspecting that it might have something to do with the Jews. And Achashverosh is looking at Esther questioningly, and she says, all I'm asking for is that you spare my life and the life of my family. And Achashverosh looks at her and says, who wants you dead? Who's trying to kill my wife? And right there in that moment, Esther points to Haman and says, this man, Haman. And Haman is in shock. He could never have imagined that the queen was Jewish. And Achashverosh gets up and he is so angry and he is so devastated that his decree and Haman's decree would have possibly killed his own wife and her family. She says, I'm Jewish. This is my nation that is about to die. And Achashverosh is so angry, he storms out of the room and he goes into his gardens. Now, it is noted that his gardens were a very calming, relaxing, and beautiful place where he would go to relax. So that was his first thing. He needed to clear his head. So he goes into the gardens, and Haman takes this opportunity and he just prostrates himself right in front of Esther, begging for his life. Please, Esther, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Now, Esther was sitting on this big, royal, lounging bed type of bench. And Haman is right in front of him on the floor. And all of a sudden, Achashverosh sees this vision of individuals cutting down the very rare trees in his garden. Now, this was actually a mirage. It was God placed angels there that weren't actually doing it, but God gave Achashverosh this vision. And Achashverosh got so angry and he said, who told you to do this? And they said, oh, Haman told us to do this. And this further made Achashverosh angry at Haman. And Achashverosh barges back into the room and he sees Haman laying down right in front of Esther. And he says, what are you trying to do? You're trying to assault my wife now also? And at that moment, he sentenced Haman to death. And Haman's face was covered. He was sentenced to death at that moment. And one of the king's advisors, an individual named Charvona, at that moment turned to the king and said, Your Majesty, I have a great idea. Right outside is the gallows that Haman built for Mordecai. Why don't you just hang Haman over there? Achashverosh says, yes. And Haman was hung on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And at that moment, the joy of the Jewish people knowing that the individual who had tormented them and who had tried to sentence them to death and who had devised this incredibly challenging circumstance for the Jews and who had written this very, very deathly decree was no longer. And again, we see how the tables turned and the whole dynamic shifted. For the Jews were now going from being on the bottom to being all the way on the top. And this theme repeats itself many times. There's the concept in the Megilah and in the story of Purim, there's the concept of v'nahapochu, which is Hebrew for to turn out a different way. And what seemed to be the most challenging situation turned out to be the most beautiful situation. And in that moment, Achashverosh recognized that Mordecai was his greatest asset. And so Achashverosh gave Mordecai the position that Haman had previously had. And Mordecai became the prime minister and the advisor to the king. And Esther was actually given Haman's palace and everything. And they were put into this beautiful position of leadership. Now, that was amazing and wonderful and beautiful for the Jewish people. But there was still a really big problem. And that problem was that on the 13th of Adar, every single Jew hater was going to pick up their weapons that they had been preparing and slaughter the Jews because the decree had been sent out to 127 countries. And even though Haman himself was killed, Haman had, as we spoke about, this incredibly strong cult following. And many, many people in Shushan wanted to carry on Haman's legacy. So they were still roaring to go to kill the Jews on the 13th of Adar. And Esther turns to Achashverosh and says, what should we do? We can't let this happen. And Achashverosh says, I'm really sorry, my hands are tied. The decree was sent out with my royal signature. It was written by Haman, but Achashverosh, the king, had given Haman this royal, the royal signature, the ring, that enabled him to make these kinds of decrees. Achashverosh says, I cannot rescind the decree. The only thing I can do is send out a new decree. And that's what happened. A new decree was sent out that the Jews are allowed to fight back. And in the decree saying that the Jews were allowed to fight back, it was written that the decree had previously been written by Haman and it had not been backed by the king, even though this was completely untrue. It had 100% been backed by the king. Achashverosh had been very happy to kill the Jews until he found out that Queen Esther, his beloved wife, was Jewish, and that the Jews were allowed to kill anyone who attacks them. Now, many people chose not to attack the Jews. But there were so many people in all of the provinces who were very excited to kill the Jews. And so now the Jews are allowed to fight, but they still need a miracle to win the wars. And that's what happened on the 13th day of Adar. On the 13th day of Adar, all of the Jews went out to fight, and they were able to kill, and thank God, with God's miracles, they destroyed all of the people who tried to destroy them. And it was a very, very, very miraculous battle. And it was a beautiful victory for the Jewish people. And the next day, on the 14th of Adar, which is the day that we celebrate Purim, was a day of incredible celebration. It was a beautiful celebration. The Jews were dancing and singing in the streets. They celebrated by giving gifts of food to each other, by giving charity to those in need. There was this incredible display of generosity, and they feasted and ate and celebrated and drank and were happy and joyful and really, really grateful to God. Now, in Shushan, because that was the capital city and that was where Haman had had his immense following, they had not yet managed to destroy all of the enemies. And so Esther requested that the Jews be allowed to fight back for one more day. And in the city of Shushan, they fought also on the 14th day of Adar. When the rest of the empire, all of the other cities were celebrating, in Shushan, they were still fighting, and they celebrated on the 15th day of Adar. And they also celebrated in this spirited, joyful way of celebrating with a feast and with the generosity and giving gifts of food and giving charity, etc. And this was a day of such rejoicing. It was a day of such celebration. And today, nowadays, from then until now, we celebrate the day of Purim to commemorate this incredible victory, to commemorate this incredible turn of events. And throughout the world, Purim is celebrated on the 14th day of Adar. Has anybody ever heard of Shushan Purim? Shushan Purim is the day after Purim. And in a city that is like Shushan, Purim is celebrated on the 15th day of Adar. Now, what do I mean by a city that is like Shushan? Well, Shushan was a city with ancient walls surrounding it. There is the city of Susa in Persia, but it's not a city. There aren't really any Jews that are there, but Mordechai and Esther are buried there. And because Shushan was a city with an ancient wall surrounding it, the rabbis decreed that any city that has an ancient wall surrounding it would celebrate Purim on the 15th day of Adar, which is why Purim in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem has an ancient wall, Jerusalem celebrates Purim the day after. So if anybody is celebrating Purim in Israel, I highly recommend on Purim you go to any other city, you celebrate, and then you go to Jerusalem and you celebrate again on the next day, because then you have 2 days of Purim. But what was this celebration? And this is where we see something so powerful. The way the Jews celebrated was by giving to others. The way the Jews celebrated was by displaying generosity and kindness. And so the way that we celebrate Purim as well is by doing the 4 mitzvot of Purim. We have the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, where we read this entire story of the Megillah, which, by the way, is not over yet. There's still more incredible things to the story. We have the story of the Megillah, which we read the night of Purim, which is like the evening before, which this year is Saturday, March 23rd. And we also read it the following day. During the day of Purim, we read the story of the Megillah. And every time the name of Haman, the evil man, is recited, is read, we use our noisemakers to boo Haman. Now, why do we have to do that? Not just because we're, want to have fun and, boo, like, when you're at a game and they have the other team scores or when they lose the ball or whatever it is. I have know nothing about sports, but I just know that there's a lot of booing and cheering in the sports games, right? We're not just booing because we heard his name and we don't like him, but because it's actually a mitzvah to remember Haman and his ancestor Amalek in order to constantly wipe out his memory. And the reason why we need to remember to destroy him is because the Haman of our lives is always present. And we always have to remember that it is our responsibility to drown out that name, to drown out that voice. And so we read the Megillah. That is the first mitzvah. The second mitzvah is to have a mishteh. A mishteh is a Purim feast. We celebrate with a Purim feast, which, by the way, we are going to be having a grand Purim feast here Sunday at 2 p.m. It's going to be amazing. We're actually doing like an Israel theme. So it's going to be like Israeli street food and take a picture at the Kotel. Lots of fun activities. You guys should come. It's going to be amazing. And the celebration takes place with eating and drinking and music and celebrating. And we have a meal to celebrate the beautiful victory that we have. And then we have the two other mitzvot of Purim, which are so beautiful. There is the mitzvah of mishloach manot, when we give gifts of food to each other. We deliver food packages for our friends, for our neighbors, specifically use it as an opportunity to give to someone that you maybe need to, make up with after a fight or something like that. The spirit of generosity, the spirit of friendship, the spirit of giving. And we do the mitzvah of matanot le'evyonim, which is basically giving financial gifts to the poor, giving charity. So we give charity to those in need, or you can give to an organization which will distribute it to people in need. And this is how we celebrate. We celebrate by remembering the story, by celebrating with joy, and by giving to others. Because this is the spirit of Purim. We want to remember the story, and we want to use our victory and our existence to give to others, to display generosity, to engage in acts of kindness. Now, this was the celebration that happened after the miraculous victory. But the story is not over, because Esther remained in the palace. She was still queen. In fact, Esther and Achashverosh had a child. And we think about the sacrifice that Esther made. She not only gave up the theory of living when she went to the king knowing that she might die, but she actually gave up her life as a Jewish woman, because after the story, when all the Jews were celebrating and went back to their lives, Esther remained stuck in the palace. And yes, she had her Jewish maids who were her loyal servants who were there for her, but she could not live as a proper Jewish woman, although she maintained her priorities and her morals and her values and kept as much of Torah as she could, but she was still the queen. And not only that, she was raising the future king of Persia, the King Daryavesh, as he was known in Hebrew, or in English, King Darius. And she knew that she needed to impart into him as much of her values as she could. But like any prince, he was surrounded by the royal advisors and he was surrounded by tutors who were teaching him the ways of the culture that he was going to live. And Esther knew that this was going to be her legacy. This story was going to be her legacy. And she sat down with Mordechai and she wrote down the entire story so that her sacrifice, her life, what she did, and the story of the Jewish people at that time should be recorded for posterity, so that every single Jew in the future would know, and every single one of us learning the story would know that we have our existence, our life, our Torah, our faith. We owe all of that to Esther for her sacrifice. And that we keep what we're supposed to be keeping, and we observe the Torah, and we do mitzvot, and we stand with Jewish pride, and we express our Jewish identity, and we share with others, and we are generous and kind, and all of that because of Esther's sacrifice. And we keep her legacy alive by doing so. And Esther pushed Mordechai to include this scroll into one of the books of the Torah. Now, there are the 5 books of the Chumash, the Bible. There are the books of the prophets. And then there are the scriptures. There are many other books like Psalms and the work of Kohelet, which was written by King Solomon, other books of Torah that are included in the 24 books of the Torah. The book of Esther is the last book that was included into the book of the Torah. And Esther pushed Mordechai being the head of the Sanhedrin, part of the judges, the Jewish court who would be able to include this. This was the last book that was entered because Esther wanted the message and the legacy to be there for all of the Jews. And here is where we learn something fascinating. The Megillah says that after this victory, after this story, the Jews accepted upon themselves that which they had previously accepted upon themselves. Now, this is a very cryptic statement. What are we talking about? What did the Jews accept upon themselves? So our sages tell us, what does this mean? When God gave the Jews the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Jews accepted the Torah. We said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do, we will listen, we accept unconditionally the Torah. And they really meant it. Unconditionally, they accepted the Torah. It was after they had been released from slavery. Remember that story? After the exodus from Egypt. And God did all of the miracles for them, and they accepted the Torah. And now the Megillah tells us that they re-accepted the Torah upon themselves. They renewed their commitment to God, just like and even stronger than they had committed to God at Mount Sinai, which is so powerful because we all know about Mount Sinai as the time when the Jews received the Torah. I mean, we celebrate Shavuot for this day that the Jews received the Torah, and we said yes, and we took the Torah, and it was like we accepted God's proposal and we got married. Now, this is not a Jewish concept, but I'm going to borrow the term for the purpose of this example. After the story of Purim, God and the Jews renewed their vows. Now, Jews don't renew our vows because we don't make vows. We have a very different type of Jewish ceremony, and we don't renew our vows. We don't need to. They're good as gold. But at Mount Sinai, when the Jews accepted the Torah, there was the possibility that maybe they didn't accept everything knowingly. They had just been taken out as slaves. They were willing to do anything for God. But did they really understand the extent of what it meant to keep the Torah, especially with all of the outside influences and other cultures? But now, after the Jews went through everything, and they saw what it was like to live on the other side, and they saw what the world looked like, and they saw what it was like to keep the Torah, and they had a temple, and the temple was destroyed, and they went through so much. They renewed their commitment to keeping the Torah willingly, with renewed energy, with renewed strength, with renewed acceptance of the entire package. The good, the bad, and the ugly. If you think about it, now, I'm actually thinking about it because God willing, coming up very soon is my 10th anniversary. And thank you. Long time coming. And I was actually thinking about it the other night. I was like, thank God, having my 10th anniversary, my husband and I, of course, I'm planning what I'm gonna buy and then have my husband pick up for me and tell me he bought me as a gift, because that's how it works, right? And um, I was thinking about it. I said, 10 years ago, I was engaged and I was so excited to marry my husband. But did I really know him as well as I know him now? Obviously not. Nobody does, right? So I was thinking, I said, and at my wedding, and think about whether it's your wedding or any other time that's the happiest day in your life. It's the happiest day in your life. You can't imagine being happier. Now, I looked a lot more glamorous on my wedding day than I do right now, or on any other given day. Let's just be real, right? I mean, it was a whole glam squad at my wedding day. Think about it, right? But thank God, I'm so much happier now than I was then. And that's knowing the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? That's knowing all the beautiful, wonderful things. My husband's perfect. He's perfect. He's perfect. But also, everybody's human. Exactly. He's the rabbi. He's perfect. No, of course, he's human. What's the idea? That when we rededicate ourselves to someone, even after we know their flaws, that's a much deeper dedication. Or think about it with somebody who has a job. You take a job, you sign the contract, you're excited about this new job. You don't really know the ins and outs, the annoying coworkers and the long hours and the smelly office, whatever it is, whatever, however there is. And then when you renew that contract, that's a real testament to your commitment to your job because you already know what's good about it and what's hard about it. And you renew it and you love it. Exactly. That was the feeling that the Jews had towards God after the story. They loved the Torah. They loved God. And this was after knowing how hard it is to keep the Torah and how difficult it is to do the right thing and how easy it is to sway and do the wrong thing. And yet they recommitted themselves to the Torah. And this is the power of the story of Purim, that they did this even though there were no supernatural miracles. The story turned out perfectly, but there were no seas splitting, and there were no plagues, and there were no, supernatural events that took place. It was real life, and that's what really tells us about our deepest connection to God. When we connect with God in the dark places, in the real day-to-day life. And that's what we learn from Esther. Because Esther remained in the palace and it was lonely. And she was never able to return to her life and her beautiful marriage with Mordecai after. And she was stuck. She was in this gilded cage, so to speak. And she connected with God in that place. She connected with God in that space of acceptance, of knowing that this was her destiny, this was where God needed her and God wanted her, and this was her mission in life. And that's where the Megillah ends. But the story of Esther actually continues. When the king Achashverosh died, his son Darius, King Dariavesh, became the king. And he was very young when he took over the kingdom. And he was Jewish because his mother was Esther, but he did not identify as a Jewish king. He was a Persian king. And yet, his mother, the dowager queen, the king's mother, had a very strong impact on him. In fact, our sages tell us that every year they would celebrate Passover with a Seder together. And this was a very beautiful nod to the fact that the fast that Esther had was the night of Passover. And if we remember when she fasted and told all of the Jews to fast before she presented herself to the king, it was a conflict because you're not supposed to fast on the night of the Passover Seder. And yet she said, we need to fast this one so that we'll have other Passovers in the future. And she celebrated Passover with her son, the king, every year. And it was to her immense delight that he filled his court with Jewish leaders to be his advisors. In fact, King Darius, was the king who allowed the Jews to rebuild the Second Temple in Jerusalem. He was the one who restarted the construction and saw it through. He actually sent a delegation from Persia and from other countries to Israel, a delegation of Jews to oversee the construction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. So we see that the story of Esther has so much meaning and it has so much beauty and it also has so much depth and tragedy for Esther herself. But the idea that Esther knew who she was and knew what her mission and her purpose was and wanted to do the right thing, even when it was so, so difficult, is a testament to how we can be like Esther as well. And this is the power of Esther, and this is the power of each one of us when we tap into Esther. And to focus on two core values in the Purim story. We have number one, the idea of accepting God and accepting and committing ourselves to our relationship with God and our relationship with the Torah from a place where it doesn't all have to be perfect in order for us to have a perfect relationship. The relationship could be perfect even when the circumstances are not. In fact, a perfect relationship is when it's strong, especially when the circumstances are not perfect. And that is the testament to our relationship with God, even when it's challenging, even when there are hardships, even when there are obstacles standing in our way. We are connected, we are committed, and we are focused on our mission. And the second, and probably most powerful, is the concept of v'nahapochu, how everything can just turn around in a moment. And this is actually why, one of the reasons why we celebrate Purim, we dress up in costumes. And a lot of people look at the whole costume thing and just be like, okay, so it's like a Jewish version of Halloween. But it's not. In fact, costume parties and the celebration of Purim is way older and a lot more ancient than any other costume party. What's the idea of the costumes? The idea that things are not what they seem. A costume is a disguise that looks different than what it really is. I mean, if I'm wearing a purple wig, which I've done, maybe I'll wear it again this year. We'll see. For anyone who remembers at the Purim party last year, a few years back, I was wearing a purple wig. You look at me, I mean, that's not what I usually look like, right? The idea of a costume is that things are not as they seem. And this is the idea of the Purim story, that things are not as they seem, even when something is so, so difficult. There is something good hiding inside. The challenges, the obstacles, the tragedies, the difficulties in our lives, that's just the costume. That's the costume that is hiding the real innate good that God has within each one of us and within each situation. So we need to take off the mask and look behind the mask and find the good in the situation. And in an instant, we can go from Mordechai sitting at the gates in mourning and wearing sackcloth and ashes on his head to riding on the royal horse with the royal garments and the king's crown. In an instant, we can go from Haman building a gallows to hang Mordechai to Haman hung on the gallows that he prepared for Mordechai. We can go from the Jews under the threat of annihilation to the Jews destroying all of their enemies. In an instant, anything can shift and everything can shift because everything is in God's hands. So, on that note, I want to say l'chaim to understanding the story of Purim. L'chaim. I will say that we have definitely gone deeper in depth, and I truly hope that whether you learned the story for the first time over the series, or you already know the Purim story, or you thought you knew the Purim story, you've learned something new. And most importantly, that we have learned and understood the deeper meaning of the Megillah and found ways that we can connect it to our lives. Because to recap the main idea that we started off this series with is that the story of the Megillah cannot just be looked at as a piece of history. It cannot just be looked at with a backwards glance. It has to be read and it has to be internalized as if it's now, because it is. The story of the Megillah mirrors our lives. Finding God in those hidden parts of our lives is something that is ongoing, and that is something that we strive for. And to relate to the characters of the story, if anyone's relating to Haman, come see me after class. But to relate to the characters and to the morals and to the values that we can learn from the characters in the Purim story, that's really our mission, to keep the story alive. So on that note, we have come to the end of our story of the Megillah. Bezrat Hashem, next week we will have a class. It'll be around other themes connecting with Purim. It'll be in preparation for Purim. And then we will be celebrating Purim, Bezrat Hashem, next Sunday. So for anyone who is excited to celebrate Purim, we're going to be having a wonderful celebration, and wherever you are, definitely celebrate Purim. The fast of Esther, which usually takes place on the 13th of the month of Adar, which is the day before Purim, this year is going to be taking place the Thursday before, because Purim is on a Sunday and we do not fast on Shabbat. Mm-hmm. And if possible, we also don't fast on Friday. So because we're anyways pushing it off, we fast the Thursday before. So in exactly 1 week is the fast day. It will not be Purim that night, but we have the fast of Esther on that Thursday. And the following Sunday is the joyous celebration, the holiday of Purim. And Bezrat Hashem, the following Wednesday, we will be having our grand challah bake. So mark your calendars. It's going to be wonderful, beautiful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all. So if anyone has any questions, please, let's hear. What's your question?
The meaning of booing the name of a man.
Yes.
Is also, I think, to do the bad thing that are in ourselves. Because we have sometimes the little voice.
100%. 100%.
So the booing is like symbolically for me is ourselves.
100%.
Bad things that come in, bad thoughts, bad things.
We're actually going to discuss that in depth next week when we talk about certain practices of the Megilah and how we can take them into our life, certain practices of the celebration of Purim. But you're absolutely correct. The evil voice within us, that voice that's trying to push us in the wrong direction, needs to be booed. It needs to be silenced. You're absolutely right.
Nobody dresses in.
Actually, so traditionally, we do not dress up as the evil characters, because what we dress up is, what we're representing. So everyone's free to do as they please. Obviously, there's no law against anything, but I certainly don't let my children dress up as any evil characters. But since my kids are dressing up like King David, a rabbi, queen, a bride, that's what's happening in my house.
Last thing. So who wrote? Esther wrote, or Manahem wrote?
So Esther and Mordechai wrote it together. Okay. Yes, and the Megillah actually They wrote
So
that Esther and Mordechai wrote it.
The woman, she could write.
Yes, absolutely. And it's called on her name. It's called Megilat Esther.
Yes.
It's not called Megilat Esther and Mordechai.
Okay.
It's called Megilat Esther.
Esther.
Yes. And by the way, she's not the only book in the Torah that's called on the name of a woman. There's also the book of Ruth.
Ruth.
Yes, women play a powerful part in the stories in the Torah.
I see.
Absolutely.
I see. I remember in the woman.
Yes, exactly.